we get started.
Okay.
All right, Karen, Jesus, I have 1 o'clock on my clock. Chairman Zavian, it's up to you if you'd like to call the meeting to order.
Thank you. The meeting of the MAG Transit Committee is called to order. Kara, will you please take a roll call?
Thanks, Vice Chair Sapien. So I'll start at the top here. Do we have Grant Anderson?
Here.
Sean Banda? Benjamin Bitter?
Here.
Kathy Borges?
Here.
Kathy Colbath? Dawn Coomer? So I have Nancy Jackson for Jason Crampton. Oh, I see you, Nancy. I just can't hear you. Jill Dusenberry.
Here.
Gabe Elias.
Here.
Eric Iverson.
I'm here.
Reed Kempton.
I'm here.
Carol Ketraside.
Here.
Jeremy Knapp. I have down a proxy, Joan Freeman for Ratna Corpella.
Oop, I wonder if Kara got frozen.
Kara, can you hear us?
There you go.
Nicole. Oh,
You
was I
froze,
frozen?
Kara? Yeah, you
Okay.
froze, Kara. So the last one we heard was for proxy for Scottsdale. So maybe go back a couple lines.
Kevin Link.
Here.
I saw you in there, I thought. So Jose Macias.
Here.
Nicole McCarty. Oh, sorry. I think this list is not up to date for Gilbert. Do we have Gilbert here?
Yeah, Nathan Williams for Gilbert.
Okay, thank you, Nathan. I apologize. I'll get this list updated. Christine McMurdy,
Here.
Judy Ramos. Jesus, I see you. I know you're there. Stephanie Small. Jody Sorrell.
Here. Here.
Kristen Taylor.
Here.
Okay, and Heather Wilkie.
Present.
And then we have a new member today joining us, Sal Lapuma. Am I saying that correctly? I think I see you in here, Sal.
Can you hear me now?
Yep, I can hear you. Thanks.
Okay, yeah.
Welcome.
Thank you.
Yep. So just want to check one more time that we don't have Sean Banda, Kathy Colbath, Dawn or Joan that has joined us since we started. I see
This
you,
is
Kathy.
Dawn Coomer. I've joined the meeting.
Thank you, Dawn. I got you too.
Kathy Colbath is here from Peoria.
Thank you, Kathy. All right, thanks everyone.
All right, thank you, Kara. Just a reminder to everyone to mute yourself when you're not speaking and to unmute yourself when you are speaking. And then I would also ask when you're going to make a motion or a second, if you would make the motion and follow up with your name and city so that we can keep track of that, please. So we will go on to item number 2. Do any members of the committee have questions or corrections to the May Transit Committee meeting minutes or June joint meeting minutes? If not, could I have a motion for approval of the May 4th, 2020 Transit Committee meeting minutes and the June 16th, 2020 Joint Active Transportation and Transit Committee meeting minutes?
I shall move. Grant, yeah.
I'll second. It's Jody.
Thank you. So we have a motion from Grant and a second from Jody. Is there any discussion on the motion? Kara, I think you'll do a roll call on the vote.
Yes, I will. Thank you. So we're going to go through this again from the top. Grant, how do you vote?
Aye.
Benjamin?
Aye.
Kathy Borges?
Aye.
Kathy Colbath?
Aye.
Dawn Coomer?
Yes.
Nancy Jackson? Nancy, I can't hear you. If you want to type in the chat box.
Whoops.
Oh, I can hear you now.
You can? Okay.
Yes, yes. How do you vote?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Jill?
Aye.
Gabe?
Aye.
Eric?
Yes.
Reed?
Yes.
Carol?
Petricide. Sorry, I got a call from my boss. Are we voting on the minutes?
Yes, we are.
Okay, yes.
Thank you, Carol. Kevin?
Aye.
Jose?
Yes.
Nathan?
Yes.
Christine?
Aye.
Judy? Oh, sorry. I don't think she's here. Jesus?
Aye.
Jody?
Aye.
Kristen?
Aye.
Heather?
Aye.
And Sal?
Aye.
So I think someone just joined us. Did someone just join us?
Stephanie Small. Aye.
Okay, thank you, Stephanie. All right, thank you, everyone. We only have to do this one more time today, so bear with us. And I'll pass it back off to Vice Chair Jesus Sapien.
Thank you. I think that went pretty well. Call to the audience. Members of the public were asked to submit written comments related to this meeting through the MAG website. Comments may be sent at any time leading up to the meeting, but must be received at least 1 hour prior to the posted start time for the meeting. MAG staff, do we have any comments from the public?
Vice Chair Sapien, we did not receive any comments. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. The script is longer than the item sometimes. Item number 4, Audra Keister Thomas, MAG Transportation Planning Program Manager, will provide a report on the Transportation Planning Program Manager.
Thank you, Vice Chair Sapien, members of Transit Committee. Good to see and hear you all today. We do have a fun agenda with reports out on some important projects. Just a few items to note to start off our day. ADOT has released a notice of funding opportunity for Section 5305 funding for rural and small UZA funding made available through COGS and MPOs. These kinds of study projects must be coordinated with and administered by COGS and MPOs. It's a fairly quick turnaround in terms of notice of interest. Carol will be sending out this information later today. If you are interested, please contact us first to discuss your potential project. Again, MAG would have to submit it on behalf of your agency for interest. Again, this is only applicable to those entities outside of the Phoenix Mesa UZA. And there is approximately 300,000 available statewide, so not a lot of funding. Again, Carol will send out information later today. Also, I want to extend congratulations to the City of Phoenix and Valley Metro on the $50 million award from FTA earlier this summer for the continued progress of Northwest Phase 2. I believe construction activities are underway, so we're seeing progress on that latest extension for light rail. Just one other note, again, to formally welcome Sal LaPuma from the Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community. Thrilled to have you aboard our transit committee, Sal. Welcome. And I think on behalf of the entire committee, anxious to see Salt River Pima Maricopa Indian Community's participation on our committee. That completes my presentation. Vice Chair Sapien, I'd be happy to answer any other questions offline.
Does anyone have any questions for Ms. Thomas? All right, seeing none, hearing none, we'll go on to item 5, Avondale Goodyear UZA prioritized project listing. Steph Stearns will present this item, and this item is for action. Steph?
Good afternoon. Thank you, Mr. Vice Chairman. As was said, my name is Steph Stearns, Transportation Planner with the Maricopa Association of Governments. Here today for action on the agenda is the Avondale Goodyear UZA prioritized project listing. Next slide, please, Kara. Some quick background on the UZA. It was designated as a small urbanized area by the US Census after a result of the 2000 census. It receives its own apportionment of FTA 5307 urbanized area funds, and it is made up of the cities of Avondale, Buckeye, El Mirage, Glendale, Goodyear, Litchfield Park, Maricopa County, and Surprise. There is the Avondale Goodyear Transit Working Group, which meets quarterly. Next slide, please. And the UZA together has developed a funding program. The program goal is to meet Federal Transit Administration transit security requirements while enhancing transit in the UZA through the implementation of associated transit improvements. Transit security are projects, or transit security is actually an FTA requirement. FTA requires that at least 1% of the annual 5307 apportionment be spent on projects that are meant to enhance the safety and security of the system. These are things like cameras, lighting, even security personnel. Associated transit improvements. These are any project that is meant to enhance and improve the use of the transit system. So these are things like accessibility improvements, bus shelters, shade, pedestrian and bicycle routes within a half-mile radius, etc. Next slide, please. To recap the most recent call for projects, it was announced on July 30th, 2020, with approximately $1.1 million available. The deadline was September 10th, and a total of 2 project submissions were received by the deadline. Next slide, please. These projects were both submitted from the City of Avondale. They submitted one project for security enhancements. This falls under the transit security category with at a total cost of $40,000. This is inclusive of their 20% local match, so the federal amount requested is $32,000. This project will install security cameras at the Avondale Park and Ride to monitor the site and install solar-powered lighting at several high-traffic bus stops. Avondale also submitted a ramp improvement project, which falls as an associated transit improvement. This project has a total cost of $120,000. Again, this includes the 20% local match, so the federal amount requested is $96,000. And this project will replace existing corner ramps with directional ramps at 9 intersections along the Avondale Zoom route. Next slide, please. Members of the Avondale Goodyear UZA working group ranked and evaluated each of the projects. Their average score and ranking are on the screen for your review. Next slide, please. From here, this item will go through the MAG committee process with a regional council approval on December 2nd. There is approximately $1 million remaining unprogrammed for this funding category, so that will be taken care of in a future call for projects. Next slide, please. Again, this is on the agenda for action today, but I'm happy to pause and take any questions in the meantime.
Do we have any questions for MAG staff on this item? Hearing none, could I have a motion to recommend approval of the Avondale Goodyear UZA prioritized project listing?
This is Christine in Goodyear, so moved.
Second, Grant, Youngtown.
Thank you. We have a motion and a second. Is there any discussion of the motion? If not, Carol will take a roll call.
Thank you, Vice Chair Sapien. All right, so let's start with Grant.
Yes.
Ben,
Aye.
Kathy Borges,
Aye.
Kathy Colbath,
Aye.
Don Coomer,
Yes.
Nancy Jackson,
Yes.
Jill,
Aye.
Gabe,
Aye.
Eric,
Aye.
Reed,
Aye.
Carol,
Yes.
Kevin,
Aye.
Jose,
Aye.
Nathan,
Aye.
Christine,
Aye.
Judy, I saw that you joined us. So
Yes, I'm here.
thank you. Yep.
Okay, great.
That's an aye, right, Judy? Just confirming. Sorry, Judy, how did you vote? I just wanted to make sure it was clear.
Oh, I'm for, yes.
Yeah, thank you. Hey, Jesus,
Aye.
Stephanie,
Abstain.
Jody,
Aye.
Kristen,
Aye.
Heather,
Aye.
Sal.
Aye.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to pass it back over to Vice Chair Sapien.
Thank you
For
so
the
much,
next item.
everybody. You're getting really good at that roll call. Thank you. So now we'll move on to item number 6, update on the commuter bus feasibility study. MAG Transportation Planner Jennifer Valentine will present this item, and this item is for information and discussion. Jennifer?
Thank you, Chair Sapien, members of the Transit Committee. Can you all see and hear me okay? I just got kicked off, so now I'm on my phone. Okay, great. Thank you for the opportunity to provide this update on the commuter bus feasibility study. Next slide, please, Kara. So when I was here in January, I believe I gave a pretty brief overview of the study, including our scope of work. So we started out with a market analysis and then developed an evaluation framework through which we evaluated a number of different alternatives. I also wanted to emphasize that our recommendations were based on both technical analysis and stakeholder input. Next slide, please. So we talked before about some of the major determinants of commuter bus demand. So we talk a lot about the travel flows between major employment centers and residential areas. So in the case of commuter bus, that's really park and ride lots and then our major job centers throughout the region. We also really focus on both cost competitiveness and time competitiveness, along with the pedestrian environment at the job center. Next slide, please. So this is a list of the major employment centers that we included in the analysis. So the map you see there has these peach circles, which show employer size by number of employees. So some of the larger ones I'll point out are, for example, the southern end of the Price Corridor, that's the Intel campus. And then some of our largest employers in the region are in the downtown Tempe ASU area. Next slide, please. So this map shows some of the heaviest travel flows for commuters throughout the region. So the thicker lines are greater flows. In this section of the analysis, a few of the job centers did drop out. So for example, Northwest Tempe and Broadway Innovation Corridor on their own didn't have a strong enough flow, but ultimately we ended up combining them. Another was downtown Scottsdale and then the Camelback Biltmore area. Next slide. So this is a summary table that shows some of those different key characteristics and how the job centers performed. So I just wanted to point out a couple of examples. So we'll talk a lot about challenging pedestrian environments and how to serve them. So Deer Valley did have a challenging pedestrian environment because it's relatively dispersed, but it had very strong worker flows, which is why it was included in the analysis in the first place. And then you see some of the top performers at the top of the list that had strong pedestrian environment, strong worker flows, and then moderate cost and time competitiveness. Next slide. So we ended up looking at several different types of service. The first was we did want to evaluate existing rapid and express routes against the same criteria we used for potential new routes. So we'll see in just a minute, there's a map of potential modifications to those existing routes. We also proposed a number of new commuter bus routes serving parts of the valley that are not already served by commuter bus. Then we looked at a combination of commuter bus and first last mile solutions to help serve some of those more challenging pedestrian environments. And then finally, we looked at a few different limited stop alternatives. Next slide. So as I mentioned, so this is a map of the existing rapid and express routes that all terminate in downtown Phoenix. So an important component of this study was seeing whether there was demand or feasibility in other parts of our region. To get right to the punchline, we found that there was. But we also wanted to, as I mentioned, just sort of see how these routes are currently performing. So that was our first step. So next slide. So we presented these routes as potential modifications of existing routes. We found some unproductive legs of existing routes or places where there might be a slightly better alignment so that the route overall could be more productive. So obviously this map is a lot to take in right now. I will offer up, we'd be happy to share the almost final draft of the final report. It's about 80 pages, and so it goes into a lot of detail about really everything I'm discussing now. So next slide. So after that first phase of analysis, we were left with the job centers you see here. There were quite a few potentially viable routes in Phoenix North Central, which is that sort of dark purple color just north of downtown Phoenix. We also had several in Deer Valley, downtown Tempe, And then just a few each in the combination of Broadway Innovation, Northwest Tempe, the Price Corridor, Southwest Tempe, and then as I mentioned, we did have 4 limited stop routes that connect multiple job centers. Next slide. So the Phoenix North Central alternatives in general performed really well. For the most part, they were kind of variations of existing routes that serve downtown Phoenix, but serving North Central. And the main reason we evaluated Phoenix North Central separately was because there's not really a great time-effective way to get from downtown Phoenix up to North Central. So it actually made sense in the analysis just to consider it as a separate job center. Next slide. So in Deer Valley, there were 6 alternatives and all relied on some type of shuttle just because the job center is relatively dispersed. So this is great because it opens up a much larger area, but it's also challenging because it introduces extra time and extra cost. Next slide. So for downtown Tempe, we looked at 6 different alternatives. This was a little bit different because we wrapped in both students and workers for ASU. So that created some pretty large travel flows, some of which were large enough to consider additional service beyond just the AM and PM peak. Next slide. So for Broadway Innovation Corridor Northwest Tempe combination, there was just 1 route we looked at. So starting at the Carl's Jr., stopping through West Mesa Park and Ride, and then heading through Broadway Innovation and up to Tempe. Next slide. So Price Corridor was kind of similar to Deer Valley in that, different shape, but still a sort of dispersed job center that needed to rely on a few different shuttles to make the service work. Next slide. And then Southwest Tempe, we looked at 2 different alternatives, one starting at the West Mesa Park and Ride and one starting at the Chandler City Lot. Next slide. So again, this is a lot to take in here, but so just to give you the overview in terms of the evaluation criteria, we looked at many of the things I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation. So the market size, the cost and time competitiveness, and then the pedestrian environment at the job center. And the way we presented it here, it's interesting because you can see at a glance, how each route got their points. So for some, it's a very strong piece is the market size of the travel flow, whereas others got a little bit of points here and there to make up the entirety of the line. Next slide. So in terms of the final results, we intentionally created this grouping. So I think one sort of last minute change that we're going to do in the final report is to make that bottom line a little bit thicker, or maybe even make it red, just to emphasize the fact that everything below that bottom line is not recommended and anything above that line is recommended. It's just in terms of the scale or the desirability of the route. And we wanted to do that because we recognize there's more than just this technical analysis, right? There's there's partnerships, there's funding opportunities. So we just wanted to emphasize that those routes within the medium performance potential could also be really strong contenders depending on the timing. Next slide. So the highest performance potential routes were either in Phoenix North Central or downtown Tempe, and a lot of that had to do with the travel flows, of course. Next slide. There were a larger group in the medium performance potential category. There were 14 different alternatives and a better representation throughout the valley. So Phoenix North Central, downtown Tempe, 1 in Broadway Innovation, 2 in Deer Valley, and then 1 of the Price Corridor alternatives. Next slide. And then those that were not currently recommended were just below a threshold that we didn't feel comfortable recommending for further study at this time. Next slide. And then I just wanted to briefly mention the 4 limited stop alternatives we looked at. So these were ways to connect different job centers, but with along arterials that warranted more stops than you would have on a traditional commuter bus route. So 4 leaving the park and ride and 4 coming into the job center, just because there's more activity along the arterial, but still provides faster service than something like local bus. Next slide. So we used pretty similar evaluation criteria. We looked at the market size, cost and time competitiveness, and accessibility. Next slide. So 3 of the 4 actually scored pretty well. There was just the one along Bell Road that we didn't feel comfortable advancing for further consideration. Next slide. So last slide here, I just wanted to mention a few additional considerations for the future, and there's a lot more detail about each of these in the final report. So we did consider things like park and ride, utilization, and fleet requirements. But because of the way we presented the recommendations as a menu of options rather than a strict sort of implementation timeline, there's some flexibility, but there's also some uncertainty about when specific vehicles might be needed, if there's enough, spare vehicles to absorb some of that additional need, when park and rides might actually become full, depending on which new routes are coming through that park and ride. But we did do our best to make estimates about when things would be needed based on the information that we had. We also looked at job center growth out to 2040 to try and get a feel for whether there were any job centers that were growing faster than the regional job growth as a whole. And then finally, kind of the elephant in the room, all of our data, of course, is pre-COVID. We started this study over a year ago. And so of course, we need to consider as we move into the future, the fact that right now commuter bus ridership is down about 90%. And that's not just our region, that's across the country. So we need to, in the future, get a better feel for whether some of these behavioral shifts we're seeing, like increased working from home and other shifts are going to be lasting, or whether that's just something we're seeing over the next few months or year, however long. And fortunately, we do have the trip reduction survey, which has, in particular, at least one question about work from home and attitudes towards transit usage. So I think that'll shed some light in the future, along with, the national trends and databases that we have available as we move towards potentially implementing some of these recommendations in the future. Next slide. Next slide, Kara.
Looks like Kara might be frozen.
Okay, well, this was my last slide. The next slide is just thank you, any questions? So that concludes my presentation. I'm happy to take any questions at this time.
Vice Chair Sapien, I'd love to just add a note or two before we open it up. Just by way of reminder, the commuter bus study, this commuter bus study was a request by member agencies as an add-on to the Regional Transit Framework Study. That work that we did was really looking at high capacity transit demand and the highest propensity for high capacity transit throughout the region. But many of you indicated a real interest in the viability and looking at the viability of expanded commuter bus network, particularly as we look forward into the next regional transportation plan development. And so just again, a reminder that this was a request as an add-on to the completion of the Regional Transit Framework Study at the request of you all. Second of all, it really does, I think, illustrate the viability of this kind of an application region-wide. I think we see that as a prosperous future going into the RTP development, also with the ability for it to be a little bit flexible, able to adapt to changes over time, and especially as we look at some of our employment centers becoming even more dense over time, a real viability, whether it's through a TDM strategy or otherwise. And so this really lays the groundwork for justification for the continued regional investment in commuter bus as we develop the next regional transportation plan, an extension of Proposition 400. So that just wanted to add that little bit of context relative to this study, Vice Chair Sapien.
Thank you so much, Audra and Jennifer, for that excellent presentation. Do we have any questions from members at this time?
Yeah, Jesus, this is Jody. I have a question.
Jennifer,
can you just remind me, this study, did it look at the like if the park and rides, the study was the routes were originating from, if they had the capacity to take on that extra ridership? Very specifically, I'm kind of concerned about the Superstition Springs Park and Ride because that's not a large park and ride to begin with. Before COVID, I think it was operating at like 70–75% capacity. So it makes me nervous when I see a lot of different express routes running out of that park and ride on top of the Broadway curve planning. And I know that's just a short-term project. Everybody defaults to wanting to add service to Superstition Springs, which is great, but I don't think the park and ride necessarily has the capacity to do that. So I'm kind of curious if when you looked at it, could the park and rides handle all of this extra capacity, or are you going to look at other facilities to handle this extra work?
Yes, Ms. Sorrell, members of the Transit Committee, we did look at current park and ride utilization levels. That's actually one addition for the final report. We added a new map showing those utilization levels. That's a little bit of what I mentioned before. There's some uncertainty about exactly when things will become over capacity, whether it is fleet or park and ride. So we did the best we could with just sort of seeing where the utilization levels currently were and trying to estimate, depending on when new routes come on board, when additional capacity might be needed. But we did not use that as, if the park and ride lot looked like it was getting full, we didn't say that a new route couldn't come through it or it couldn't be viable. It's just, of course, that would be an additional expense to expand or form a new partnership.
Okay, it's just something I think we need to be very, very careful of going forward in looking at some of these facilities and looking at routes, because, if we're looking at adding new service that goes further into, goes into Tempe or goes further into Phoenix, being where the Superstition Springs Park and Ride, just using that as an example, is located, it's drawing from Queen Creek, Santan Valley, Apache Junction, new riders from beyond Mesa, way beyond Mesa, to come in there. So I do have some concerns about that. And, express riders are persnickety, to say, be nice. And if they have to walk, God forbid, a little bit to get to their park and ride, it's not going to be a pleasant experience at that point. So how do we then look at being able to address when looking long-term, because you just can't build a park and ride overnight. How do we look at addressing expanding those facilities? At what point? And maybe that's not part of this study, but if this study is moving into a future RTP discussion, we need to be able to plan at that part of it as well.
Absolutely. I think those are great points. And it goes back a little bit to Audra's point about the overarching purpose of this study. And, I know when we do these studies, everybody wants to be able to just grab the final report and just go implement it. But unfortunately, there is a little bit of additional, analysis that needs to be done, or there's some decisions to be made at the time of implementation. I mean, for example, some of the routing could be a little bit different at the time of implementation. There's not just one right way to route something, and the same with the park and ride lots. Definitely hear your point about needing to think ahead. They are big, expensive propositions. So I think to the extent that we can, we do want to be considering those types of things in the RTP. Certainly commuter bus is envisioned as a programmatic element in the RTP. I don't know if Audra wants to add anything about that.
Certainly, many of you submitted park and rides as part of the RTP call for projects. We certainly see the need for additional either expansion or new park and rides, obviously, since we're looking out to a horizon of 2050, if you will. So clearly that's going to be a need moving forward. I think we want to do a better job of identifying those important park and ride assets moving forward and doing a performance-based approach to it. But I think aligning with service needs and desires is really critical. And so this is a collaborative effort, Ms. Sorrell, and I think we plan to leverage the data sources we have available as we move into the RTP development.
Anyone else?
Yeah, thanks, Jesus. This is Christine from Goodyear. Hey, Audra, in general, I remember when we talked about this study as we were going through it, and you had indicated, and it's not unusual, that there are updates to these studies that are done periodically. You know, there's generally a need just based on, especially now with COVID, you know, the uncertainty of how certain areas of the valley are growing. And to Jody's point, you know, she's not going to be kept in the loop in terms of, you know, those areas that are sending passengers her way. How often are these studies updated? Just in general, I'm not going to hold you to it, because in Goodyear, I know that we've got a development, you know, just a lot going on in our industrial corridor that could force some changes in express bus service, you know, within the next 5 years. I mean, being somewhat liberal there, but how often in general do you guys decide to do an update to a study?
You know, Vice Chairman Sapien, Christine, I think great question. It depends on the type and kind of study. You know, in this case, for a demand-based peak period, mainly focused effort, you know, this is a 3 to 5 year update, or as conditions necessitate, we could even, and in partnership with Valley Metro, of course, look at specific O&D patterns on the ongoing basis, right? You know, if there is an emerging market within a specific region of the valley where we're connecting a couple of employers or seeing an increase in origin destination movement, that's certainly something with Valley Metro in a service planning aspect we can evaluate. And so I would say typically a full-on regional study like this, you know, 3 to 5 years, certainly. But certainly on a more acute fashion, ongoing, right? Especially as we, we do every 6 month service change arrangements. And as we move into the RTP process, I think we see this as a programmatic aspect to invest in, and not that we're going to be able to successfully guess all the routes out to 2050, right? We need to be flexible and accommodate growth patterns and changes in dynamics as we move forward. So does that answer your question, Christine?
Yeah, it does. Thanks, Audra.
Sure thing.
Anyone else? So what I would opine on this, and I think it also is going to somewhat dovetail into the next item, my comments in general, is while Audra says, the 3 to 5 year, time frame might be some, a lens within which we look at these things. I think we're going to have to remain flexible in the coming years, not knowing what's going to happen with rapid express or other type of commuter bus service, because I think our first effort, for those of us that have seen the survey that Valley Metro did and has posted and covered at a couple meetings so far, and will be discussed again at this week's TMC RMC, is the survey. And so I think all of that kind of, will become a work in progress in terms of, honestly, just getting back to the commuter ridership that we had pre-COVID. I know that, there's been a little bit of tweaking to a couple of the express routes recently because of some of the ridership that's been seen there. But for the most part, we're not there yet. And I think it's going to take us a while to get back to what we would call, regular ridership, i.e. pre-COVID. So we're going to take a wait and see approach. And I think that's going to kind of be our first chapter, getting back to regular ridership. And then chapter 2 will be, I think, moving forward on things like this, which is basically expanding that commuter service. So it'll be really interesting, and I look forward to everyone's input because it is going to be interesting to see, the travel patterns that we're seeing, what routes, what trips. I know, for example, on Phoenix's behalf, out of all of our rapid routes, it's I-17 that's kind of starting to see a little bit of a need to add some trips versus our others. I mean, we'll certainly keep an eye on it and add as necessary, but it's going to be incumbent upon all of us to kind of just, keep taking those snapshots of what these commuter routes look like, get back to regular ridership, and then, move forward with this. So great input from everybody and great questions from everybody. Thank you for that information. If anyone doesn't, if there's no more comments or questions, we'll move on to item number 7. Update on the regional bus rapid transit feasibility study, and Ms. Valentine will also present on this item, and this item is for information and discussion.
Thank you, Vice Chair Sapien, members of the Transit Committee. You're seeing a lot of me today. Apologies for that, but thank you for the opportunity to also provide an update on the Regional Bus Rapid Transit Feasibility Study, which is ongoing. Next slide, please. So a quick overview of the study. The major purpose is really to gauge both the interest in and feasibility of implementing regional BRT. A couple of our major tasks are recommending a set of locations or corridors where regional BRT could connect into future City of Phoenix BRT lines. And we're also developing a set of regional BRT performance and design standards to assist with future implementation. So throughout this process, we've been coordinating pretty significantly with the City of Phoenix, Valley Metro, and the member agencies that are within our study areas, both on our outreach and technical elements. And there's been a real focus throughout the project on both public and stakeholder outreach and education, given that this is a new mode for our region. Next slide. So it's just outlined some of the major tasks of the study. We did start out with an existing conditions review that has been completed. Next, we developed a vision, goals, and objectives, not just for the study, but for regional BRT in general. That has also been completed. Now we're in the midst of task 5, which is developing those BRT performance and design criteria that I mentioned. We did complete task 6, which was an opportunities and challenges assessment, and we really focused on transportation technology that would influence the implementation of BRT. And then the other task that we're heavily involved in right now is task 7, where we're starting to identify and evaluate different potential corridors throughout the region. Next slide. So this is our project schedule. We started the project towards the end of 2019. So when I was here in January, we had really just kicked off the project. Of course, you'll see here we are in October. So well over halfway through the project. So I have a lot more to report now. You'll see the lines closer to the bottom align with what I just mentioned. So the orange line that we're towards the later stages of the performance and design criteria. And then the blue line is the identifying the regional system. Next slide. So I just wanted to point out sort of how we came up with our study area. So the background of this map might look a little bit familiar. So we started out with the highest performing corridors for high capacity transit from the Regional Transit Framework Study update. So we started out with the extent of that map, drew a buffer around it, and then kind of smoothed out some of the edges. We wanted to include some of the area down in the southeast to encapsulate the 202 and some other areas. So we ended up with portions of Glendale, Phoenix, Scottsdale, Tempe, Mesa, Gilbert, and Chandler. Next slide. So this map, so similar background, you probably remember, many of you. So the darker blue is the strongest potential corridors for high capacity transit. What I wanted to highlight here was just how nicely the 6 corridors that the City of Phoenix is evaluating for BRT align with the recommendations from the RTFSU. So Kara, if you'll scroll through, there are 6 corridors that should pop up. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. So always very nice when study recommendations align so well. Next slide, please. So as I mentioned, we started out the study with kind of a market analysis. We did a pretty standard transit propensity. We advanced the methodology from the RTFSU as well as some of the work that the City of Phoenix has been doing for their BRT corridors. We looked at things like minority and low income populations, youth, seniors, zero vehicle households, and people with disabilities, because as we all know, these are the populations that are more likely statistically to use transit. Next slide. We also went through an exercise with our technical advisory group and stakeholders to identify some of the most important regional activity centers that we would all like to see served by BRT in the future. Next slide. And then our next task was to develop a vision for regional BRT. So I won't read it here, but I'll just point out we really wanted to emphasize connecting people, places, and opportunities. We thought that the process itself was really important. So we have been working closely with stakeholders, residents, and transit providers. And then finally, that final point of emphasis is just creating a more balanced transportation network. Next slide. And then same with all of the goals and objectives. I won't read them all, but I'll just point out some nice overlap with the first goal and some of the goals of our regional transportation plan that we're currently developing. So focusing on mobility, accessibility, and connectivity. Also working really closely with the cities and towns within our study area, just to ensure that what we're recommending and what we're talking about is in line with their local plans and studies. Again, the emphasis on the process itself, so getting that regional support, always looking to increase the attractiveness of transit service. I already mentioned the focus on the transportation technology. We felt like that was a really important point of emphasis, just given how quickly things are changing, especially in the world of transportation technology. And then finally, considering different types of sustainability in a future BRT system. Next slide. So in developing the performance and design standards, it was really important to us to develop meaningful standards. So to know that if we're calling something BRT, it shares a certain set of characteristics, that there's at least some consistency between the cities and towns within our study area, but also allowing that corridor level implementation flexibility because the cities and towns within our study area are diverse. The corridors are diverse. Even if you drive along one corridor for 3 or 4 miles, the character and the land use can change significantly, and we recognize that. So throughout the development of these standards, again, really significant collaboration with Valley Metro and City of Phoenix, along with our technical advisory group. We started out with the FTA guidelines for BRT. Of course, that had to be our minimum. We layered on top of that what the Valley Metro TSPM has to say about BRT, and then also took into consideration how the City of Phoenix is defining BRT for that subset of our study area. So ultimately, what we're ending up with is a set of recommended or required components versus other amenities that are nice to have and can help sort of if we had a point system or a scoring system, we can kind of help raise that points to a level of sort of more feasibility or more attractiveness. Next slide. So I just wanted to point out a few of the most important tools in the BRT corridor toolbox that we're talking about here. So we've had some really good and some heated, but altogether good conversations with our advisory group about things like platform level boarding or near level boarding, the types of amenities we provide at stops and stations. Of course, dedicated lanes is always a hot topic, but it's a really important one for BRT. And we've talked a lot about the different types of compromises that can work really well, whether they're different types of shared lanes or other ways to give BRT vehicles priority through things like queue jump lanes or transit signal priority or even preemption. We're also including discussions about the types of amenities you can include along with stops and stations, things like lighting and pedestrian and bicycle improvements. The little symbol there with the 2 buses and the clocks, frequent all-day service is of course a hallmark of BRT. And then finally, of course, we always are including ADA accessibility in our studies. Next slide. So these are just a few examples from places around the country. I just wanted to highlight sort of that diversity element, the fact that BRT is a flexible mode. It can look different in different places. You can have dedicated lanes or you can have a combination. You can have a transit only corridor or transit with pedestrians. You can have a center station or you can have side stations. So there's a lot of flexibility that I think is really going to benefit us as a region as we move towards hopefully future implementation. Next slide. So in terms of the opportunities and challenges assessment, we have been focusing on transportation technology. We're wrapping in things like microtransit, shared mobility, and mobility hubs, sort of recurring themes from a lot of our committee meetings and smaller area studies that are going on. We're considering how are things like connected and autonomous vehicles going to influence BRT implementation? What about alternative fuels? Do we need to be planning for charging stations? And then things like lane configurations, how they can work along with transit signal priority and queue jumps to give BRT vehicles that sort of priority that we hear over and over is so important for reliability and travel time savings. And then finally, frankly, the types of passenger amenities that people expect now, for a modern BRT system, whether it's, an app or real-time information. Next slide. Okay, so here's the fun part. So what we've been doing in terms of collaboration and outreach, I've mentioned our technical advisory group a few times. That's comprised of representatives from the cities and towns within our study area, along with Valley Metro. So we've been working with them really closely throughout the study. We also held a series of stakeholder interviews with those cities and towns just to get a one-on-one feel for kind of what their needs and desires were. We had a series of peer agency interviews to see what we could learn from other places around the country who have already implemented BRT. So our project webpage is kind of like the first and easiest stop for accessing any of these other materials. We tried to make it really easy to remember. It's just azmag.gov/BRT. There you'll find an educational video we created. It's about 3 minutes long. If you haven't already taken a look, please do. It's on YouTube. We also have an online survey. It's only 10 questions, and then an interactive comment map. And the most exciting piece of news is just this morning, our virtual public meeting launched. We created a virtual room where you can see a couple of videos and boards and an interactive map showing the universe of BRT corridors that we're just starting to evaluate. So we tried to make it fun and interactive. So in case you can't click on that link, again, you can access it from our project webpage, or it's magbrtopenhouse.com. Next slide, please. That concludes my presentation. I'm happy to answer any questions at this time.
Vice Chairman Sapien, I'd love just to add a few notes. I think we're really excited and have been working in lockstep with the City of Phoenix after the successful passage of T2050 and the endorsement of your own BRT program. I think MAG felt incumbent upon the opportunity to coordinate with the City of Phoenix and have been partnering these studies shoulder to shoulder, because of the viability of a regional application to bus rapid transit alongside the City of Phoenix. And so I think we're in tandem and working in tandem, especially as we go into the RTP development with the potential viability of an investment of a regional bus rapid transit system. And I'm excited about this milestone with a public open house over the course of this next month and to knit together those results alongside the City of Phoenix. So really pleased to present this milestone to you. More work certainly underway, but really exciting opportunity for the region.
Thank you both for the presentation and comments. Does anyone else have any comments on this item?
Mr. Chair, this is Christine.
Go ahead.
So first of all, Jennifer, don't ever apologize for presenting 2 studies in a row. For anybody that doesn't know, Jennifer is also leading our Avondale-Goodyear UZA transit study right now, and she is an absolute pleasure to work with. So I'm just tossing that out there. Don't you dare apologize.
Thank you.
Secondly, so Jennifer, first and last mile, you've got, the first thing I, of course, do when I look at the map, and if you could go back to that slide, that'd be helpful. When I look at the map, I look for how far it's going to go in the West Valley. And obviously, you have to take into account land use and geography and all those other things to know where it's going to operate most efficiently. But what's come to mind for, I think, some of us is we're on the fringe or on the outside of these and this isn't just for bus rapid transit, it's also for express bus, where there's limited opportunities for people that live outside of the core of the cities. And this also goes to people who live in the West Valley, maybe go to Tempe for work, or to Gilbert, or to Chandler. So first and last mile has become this kind of bubble over everything that's been presented to me in the last couple of months, maybe last year or so. We haven't had a presentation on that. And not that maybe I'm missing something, but I don't recall a study. And now we're offering all of these high capacity transit opportunities. And I'm sure people that live north of Glendale Avenue, west of, 99th Avenue in the West Valley, or even to Jody's point about Mesa and all of the growing cities around her. Are we going to, first of all, for Jennifer, for you, was there any look at first and last mile in the cities that does offer BRT, how often that's utilized so that people can connect to BRT? And then I don't want to burst Audra's bubble on the next presentation, but this was one of the reasons that some of us were kind of holding our breath on taking circulators and possibly even microtransit off of the list of options that the managers and the regional council and the TPC were voting on. And I'm throwing major props out to Chandler, because their mayor was really the most vocal about keeping those options in play, because those can operate on a regional level, especially if they're providing first and last mile connectivity. So I know it's a huge question, but Jennifer, if you could just answer the part about first and last mile, if that was looked at in either the Phoenix or the regional BRT study, and then I'll let Audra address my other question when she makes her next presentation.
Yes, Ms. McMurdy, members of the Transit Committee, thank you for the question. Just one quick point of clarification. So this is not the map of corridors that we're studying. I didn't include that because it's still very preliminary. It is available on the open house site, but we're getting comments on it right now. But fair point. I mean, it is relatively similar in terms of the extent and the major arterials that we're looking at. I just wanted to clarify that this is not the map. But in terms of the peer agency interviews we did, actually, interestingly enough, Christine, one of the peer agencies we interviewed for the Avondale Goodyear transit feasibility study, we talked about BRT because it's a more suburban style BRT. So it's in Snohomish County, Washington. It's their blue line. And throughout that conversation, I was taking so many notes for the BRT study. There was a lot of overlap. But so we had a lot of good conversation there about how BRTs can be successful in a slightly less dense environment. And they also mentioned in another one of those interviews, we also learned about San Joaquin County and how they're doing sort of microtransit solutions countywide. So not specifically for the BRT study, but in a lot of recent peer agency interviews, we've learned a lot more about the types of solutions we're talking about here. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I appreciate that. I guess I'm looking at, when I look at it, and again, we're all looking at our own city, but I know that bus rapid transit would not function well west of 99th Avenue on McDowell, just because there's some geography before it gets to Goodyear that would make it really not efficient. And so, I mean, I don't want to insert whatever our issues are into this, but I wouldn't want a voter to look at this and go, why would I pay a tax if it's not coming to me? And we can solve those kinds of questions with first and last mile. So I'm just kind of hoping that that's something that's on the horizon, and it can be maybe Valley Metro's looking at it that we don't know about, but it just seems like a lot of what we need to do looking forward to bridge those, the next 20 years or so, is be able to at least offer people a solution for how to connect to all of these other transit options. We're going to have the light rail coming out to 79th Avenue. There's so many things that people are going to want to connect to in order to widen their opportunity to get good jobs. And being able to offer first and last mile solutions that are efficient and effective for reaching the rest of the valley I think is important to whatever we're going to put out to voters. So thank you, Jennifer. I appreciate that. And I'm going to look forward to hearing more about that as it pertains to the UZA study. So thank you.
Yeah, Ms. McBurdy, members of the Transit Committee, I think bridge was a great word because, I think that's exactly what first and last mile solutions do. They, you think about a traditional transit stop or station, and there's the limiting factor is how far people are willing to walk, right? But if you have bikes or scooters or some other type of solution, it expands that catchment area a little bit, but you still have to have some decent density within that catchment area. So I think it can kind of get some areas over the hump, but it's definitely not going to be the thing that brings BRT to lower density areas.
Yep, gotcha. Thanks so much, Jennifer.
Anyone else have any questions or comments? Hearing none, I'll put my usual 2 cents in. I know that when we started off our BRT program, what I emphasized was not only internal staff who are leading up the effort, but our multiple consulting teams that we're working with. It kind of dovetails with what Christine is mentioning. And so to Jennifer's point, if you're looking at the map and you look at the blue lines, I would call that, the core of your corridor, but not necessarily the endpoints. Because what I emphasize with our team is if you have a line on a map, let's do our best to, if necessary, extend it a mile or two so that we end up at something like a park and ride, transit center, central station, things like that. So that when we promote these corridors, it's not seen as a hindrance, either how do I get to that end of the line, or what do I do when I deboard at the end of that line? Is there a place where there is a ticket vending machine, some parking spaces, shade, things like that, instead of just having a line on a map. So I think that map that Jennifer referred to is absolutely something, that still has a little bit of flexibility and a little bit of a work in progress aspect to it. So good work and good input from everyone. Thank you.
Yes, if I may very quickly, Chair, Vice Chair Sapien, members of the Transit Committee. That was part of the reason we went through the exercise of identifying some of the activity centers so we could identify logical starting and ending points for lines. And we've also talked a lot about doing sort of stages or phases. And so, we might show those core lines being more viable in the midterm, and then sort of longer term, more aspirational. But we did want to be careful, especially with the open house, not to get people's hopes up, right? We don't want to show lines extending out into areas that really just aren't ready for BRT. So it was a little bit of a balancing act.
Absolutely, thank you.
Thank you.
So moving on, item number 8, update on the development of a new regional transportation plan. Ms. Keister Thomas will present on this item, and this item is for information and discussion.
Thank you, Chairman Sapien, members of Transit Committee. I'll work through this presentation. I know we're already after 2 o'clock, and some of you may have seen some of these pieces. We are presenting in a joint meeting at RTAG with Valley Metro later this month, and so more detail coming. Next slide, please. So I wanted to touch on the peer region analysis. It's particularly germane to a key topic I'm going to continue to say over and over again, and that's funding availability. Next slide. We're really struggling, and we'll have a lot of future tough conversations ahead, realizing that we just don't have the funding available to meet the gross number of transportation needs we have in this region, and that span all type and kind. And so we did this peer region analysis initially just to make sure that we knew what others were up to, key success stories, things that we could steal perhaps from some of our regions. But you'll see here, we spent a lot of time in doing some comparative analysis on portfolios of revenue, and that was really important. And I wanted to share those results in particular because I think it provides a lot of context, especially to our transit conversations. Moving forward, next slide. So you'll see here the peer regions we used in the analysis. Most of them focused west of the Mississippi, high growth areas in particular, similar to our own region. Next slide. And first and foremost, one of the important takeaways is something that I had sensed all along, but we really needed to dig in and better evaluate, and that is our comparative peer region revenues available. And you'll see MAG here on the far left side. Per capita, we're about $476, but you'll see we're one of the lowest in peer comparative revenues. And you'll see some of our friends, whether it's Wasatch Front up in Salt Lake City or San Diego, really significantly outpacing us in investment size for transportation. Next slide, please. So we wanted to dig a little deeper. Here's some examples just on regional county taxes. Not uncommon, you've heard us say it before, MAG is proud to be one of the first to establish a countywide transportation sales tax to leverage the opportunity for transportation investments. We did that in 1985, as you are all aware, with Proposition 300. We have been now surpassed by many others who certainly use at least a half cent, if not several stacked on top of each other. Dallas-Fort Worth area has 2 half-cent sales taxes plus an additional 1 cent to fund their transit system. Sandag, or San Diego next door, has a half cent. LA has 4 different stacked half cents to deliver their transportation portfolio. Friends in Twin Cities have an underlying property tax. Next slide. We've been monitoring our peer regions. We're not the only ones that are preparing to expand or extend a taxing initiative. In fact, many of our peers are doing that right now. We've been tracking that, particularly with the pandemic. San Diego was one of those preparing to go to the ballot this November. Sandag had gone just a year or two ago to their voters to extend and expand their current half-cent sales tax. They were unsuccessful. You have to have a supermajority in California, just as an aside. So their state legislature gave the authority for their transit entity to go to the ballot. They had been preparing to do so for a half-cent transit tax this November. But earlier this summer, they made the decision to postpone going to the ballot, and will make that decision next year. Next slide. Of things that are extremely clear when we did our peer region analysis is that this disproportionate investment in transit becomes very clear. You'll see MAG highlighted here. As you know, we have a half cent. A third of that goes to transit, so 0.17%. But when you look across our peer regions, it is not uncommon to have a full cent dedicated to transit, if not more. And you'll see throughout all of these examples, whether it's, again, Salt Lake City at 2.5%, or Chicago with additional sales taxes in their counties, it is significantly more than we invest in transit here. And that's why we see the pinch, quite frankly, in expanding of a transit network. Next slide. I do want to point out that Campo, that's the Austin area region. They do have an existing full cent for transit. They are going to the ballot this November to institute a property tax and at a 8.75% property tax. And that's to further extend their transit portfolio. That's inclusive of light rail expansion as well as operations. Next slide. So again, just some conclusions from our peer region analysis. Our peer regions are outpacing us in the amount of investment they're placing in transportation. Some of that's because there are more significant state resources. As you know, our state legislature has yet to act in increasing the gas tax, which were one of the lowest in the country, has not been increased since the year 1991. In fact, less revenues in the gas tax then than there is this year, even equalized for inflation. In addition to that, most other states have a dedicated funding source that support transit. Unique in Arizona, we do not. We certainly have LTAF, which provides a little bit of funding at the local level, but in terms of a dedicated funding source at the statewide level for transit, there is none. We continue to see constraints at the federal level. Certainly we see that in the CIG program, and certainly lots of uncertainty to the other federal formula streams that come into the region. Operations and maintenance funding is commonly included and is funded at the regional level. There are opportunities to leverage other revenue sources, including P3s, tolling, managed lanes, et cetera, that are employed in many of the other peers that are not invested or employed here in this state or within our region. And of course, using scenario planning really helps policymakers weigh the tough decisions that come in trade-offs. Next slide. So I wanted to orient ourselves in the latest of our performance-based evaluation process. We are required to develop an RTP that's performance-based, both from federal statute as well as the state law. You'll see here our kind of our funneled process. All of you who facilitate local planning efforts know you start with a big scope of need and then ultimately refine that down to the highest performing and a fiscally constrained portfolio. Next slide. I wanted to update you on the vision for the RTP. We moved this through our policy committees right before summer. Nothing unique here. We're attempting to establish a sustainable, resilient, multimodal transportation investment program that connects people with opportunities to prosper and thrive. And we're going to do that through 6 key goals. Next slide. Safety and mobility, prosperity, responsiveness, livability, and preservation. So again, nothing necessarily unique here. Many of these align with our current RTP goals, but certainly also based on feedback from member agencies, illuminate some of the unique characteristics and diversity that we have in this region. Next slide. This is the performance-based evaluation process. You'll see it here in steps. We start with a full needs catalog, a universe of potential ideas to employ here in this region. We apply a regionally significant test in step 1, and that's the step that we are through now. You'll see step 2, we do an evaluation on the regionally significant projects. Those are the big capital intensive and capacity adding investments, freeway, highway, large corridors on our arterials, high capacity transit, for example. Step 3 is when we take a step back and look at our initial performance. What are the highest and best projects and programs, and does it look right? Does it seem to provide balance across the region? Are there any special circumstances? Maybe a project did not score well on a purely technical evaluation, but certainly addresses an important need, whether it's an environmental justice matter or potential unique attribute to one of our major activity centers or a particular freight corridor. And then step 4 is really the sausage making process, where we ultimately take those highest performing aspects and apply different scenarios. That's inclusive of revenue scenarios. We are going to be evaluating not only a continuation of the half-cent sales tax, but also an increase to that. Clearly, as we've indicated before, we are fiscally constrained in a considerable way, looking right now at about $50 billion deficit between identified needs and available revenues. And right now, if we just continue status quo, we really only will be able to deliver Proposition 400 for the next 20 years. And I think that is something we don't take lightly. We want to make sure, especially when you look at our other peers who are really outpacing us in terms of transportation investments, the reality is there's an economic development consequence as well. And we want to make sure our policymakers have all the information available as we continue to work through that trade-off analysis. Next slide. So I'm going to provide just a bit of an update here. We're at the front end of this process. We do have a draft needs catalog that has been distributed now over a month ago. It's comprised of about 1,400 different entries. It includes deferred projects out of Proposition 400. It includes the regionally studied investments that Valley Metro certainly has studied over the last 10 years or so. We're also working hand in hand with Valley Metro and ADOT. They're looking to make sure we don't have any other system-wide gaps that we would otherwise include in the catalog before we finalize it. And of course, it comprises the submissions from member agencies as part of the RTP call for projects earlier this year. We have also applied our first step of regional significance, identifying those large capital intensive regionally significant projects that we will do a technical evaluation score versus the potential programs. We definitely see the opportunity to expand the number of programs in the upcoming RTP and extension. In part, we think that helps us to be more flexible and nimble into the future, but we also see a greater need, and it's certainly better to accommodate the diversity of needs across the region. So I'll report out on the outcomes of that regional significance test next. Next slide. So just by way of reminder, we talk a lot about the 3 signature programs of Proposition 400, the Freeway Lifecycle Program, the Transit Lifecycle Program, and the Arterial Lifecycle Program, or ALCP, TLCP, and FLCP. They are by far the vast majority of the investment that comes through the Proposition 400 era programs. They make up about over 95% of the total available funding, both in sales tax as well as federal funding. But I don't want it to get lost that we don't have a few other programs, some of which you are familiar with because you work on different committees, whether it's the 5310 program. We certainly have 2 active transportation programs, several safety programs, an ITS commitment, certainly. We have air quality programs that are required in order for us to continue to receive federal funding because we are in a non-attainment area. Litter and landscape, as well as the Pinell County program after the 2010 census. Next slide. So when we received the call for projects this summer, we spent time reviewing all of those entries. Many of you participated as part of staff for your member agencies in that effort. Once we sorted out the regionally significant projects out of our 3 major modal categories, freeways and highways, transit, and arterials, we were left with approximately 776 different submissions. We wanted to group these into potential programs that made some sense, not only if it was perhaps an extension or expansion of an existing MAG program. You'll see those highlighted here with an asterisk, but many new kinds of programs that you all submitted as part of that call for projects. In total, there's approximately 40 different programs that were submitted, categorized as part of the catalog. Next slide. We presented these to our policy committees, starting with our management committee work group September 9th, and then all the way through the policy committee process last month. MAG made an initial recommendation on which ones should move forward in the process, at least past the next step, which ones perhaps should fall aside. And our recommendations were based kind of threefold. One, a continuation of existing regionally significant programs, so continuation of Proposition 400 era programs. 2, federally required programs and or investments. Again, I always use the air quality aspect. We are required to invest. Again, our federal funding has strings attached. And so those kinds of federally required programmatic aspects, we certainly recommended to be included to move forward. And then 3, we wanted to be consistent with Proposition 300 and 400's legacy, which is we're investing in regionally significant investments. What you'll see here is the final recommendation out of step 1, which is what programs continue on, which ones fall aside. And I'll make a couple of notes. You'll see the programmatic aspects on the left side are moving forward in the process. So deemed as regionally significant, they'll continue on. I want to caution everyone, this is only the first step. This is only the first opportunity to start taking things off of our plate. We still have, as noted, about a $50 billion deficit, and we're going to have to continue to peel this down into smaller and smaller available programs. The reality is, especially if we only stay at a half cent, we'll be very limited, and we'll have to even reconsider existing deferred programs and or projects in order to be able to forward anything new as part of the extension and the new regional transportation plan. So while this is a first step, this doesn't guarantee funding for those programs that are on the left side. It certainly doesn't guarantee full funding. And ultimately, we're going to have to continue to pare down these potential programs for consideration. On the flip side, this isn't the final call either. As we move through the process, we may get feedback, especially from the public, that we might be missing something. Or when we look back and take a look at the highest and most significant or highest performing projects and programs across the region, we might identify some potential gaps. So some of these things might come back or be enveloped into a full program. I just want to point this one out because it's an easy one. Pedestrian shade isn't moving forward, at least as a dedicated program. But that's not to say that the eventual implementation of an active transportation program suite couldn't potentially include a pedestrian shade element, especially in coordination or combination with our transit stops. So again, this is going to continue to be iterative until the final elements. And even so, the ultimate implementation policy for some of these programs won't actually take shape until after the RTP is developed and before funding is even becoming available in 2026 and beyond. Next slide. So just wanted to brief you on a couple of the next steps. Next slide. We do have that joint presentation we will be facilitating with Valley Metro at the next RTAG meeting. I believe that's the 19th of this month. I believe it was moved to a Monday. So we're looking forward to that opportunity. Many of you will be in that meeting there as well. And then at the end of the month, our next management committee work group will be focused on presenting our final project evaluation framework. We presented that earlier in the year and got feedback from member agencies. We'll be presenting the final version of it for make sure everyone's on board with it before we move into that evaluation process, as well as talking and doing a more in-depth evaluation and presentation of financial projections, both on a federal side, which is highly risky when you're trying to guess what congressional decisions out to the year 2050 might be, but also, quite frankly, from a sales tax revenue perspective as well. So we'll be doing a deep dive into revenue projections. Next slide. Just a final plug, we are live with our Momentum website and social media. Really appreciate your agency's support and partnership. As we all have now been faced with, we're going to be relying ultimately on virtual tools to engage the public, at least for the foreseeable future. Lucky for us, we have that in the contract and are easily able to pull off live town halls or meetings. We currently have some questions up on our website that our managers are asking for feedback on. But we're going to have to leverage a virtual feedback loop more so than we had anticipated at the beginning of this project, and really appreciate in advance your partnership in helping to spread the word and get folks engaged, because it'll be a platform that we use significantly. So with that, I will step back. I'm happy to answer any questions from the Transit Committee.
Thank you, Audra. Do any members have questions on this item?
Hey, Audra, it's Jody. I just have a quick question. When you talk about reviewing and doing the peer analysis, which was great, I'm just curious, does MAG have the same peers as Valley Metro has peers? Because a lot of us, you know, when we're at Valley Metro, they talk about their peer agencies. So there's a certain set mentally in our, that kind of we default to, it's who they are, but it doesn't look like your MAG's peers are the same. Is that correct?
Jody, that's a great question. Off the top of my head, I can't remember what Valley Metro's peer agencies are. We did a much larger swath, as you see. I think we did up to 15 different peer agencies, in part because we weren't just focused on the transit component. We were focused on the portfolio of the kind of region, size and demographics as well. I think many of the peers that Valley Metro does use were included in our peer region analysis, but I'd have to confirm with Carol offline, and I can get you that answer offline, Jody.
Okay, you can just talk about it at the RTAG presentation.
Oh yeah, sure, certainly.
Thanks.
Hey, Seuss and Audra, this is Eric in Tempe. You guys hear me?
Sure can.
Mine's maybe a little, maybe a question, but kind of a comment. The information you share about the peer region analysis and the lack of funding and the challenges we have for funding in this region are pretty astonishing, but it's very clear information, so I appreciate it. And it's, to me, the presentation really resonates and kind of hits that fact. Even though it is depressing. I'm wondering, I think it's great information. I'm wondering if you're getting any response or kind of what you're hearing as you share this information with elected officials, those that will really, be leading the charge with how we approach this regional transportation plan, Prop 400E, and if there's any momentum for any change or looking at scenarios that would give us more funding or better funding for expansion of our regional system.
That's a fantastic question, Eric. I'm so pleased that you asked it. One of the reasons I felt so strongly that we did do that analysis is because my sense was that we were underinvesting relative to our peers, especially in transit, and we were feeling it on the transit side. And so I'll talk to the current audience. I felt that, but I don't know that that was a shared reality. And even last fall, when we provided some of the initial numbers associated with projected revenues to, at that time, known need from a regional perspective, we were purporting about a $30 billion deficit. And I think at that time that was pretty shocking. I don't know if it was believed. And I think when we started the peer region analysis, we wanted to do and spent many months. It's not an easy analysis to do because it's apples to pomegranates most of the time, depending on how each region is comprised. But what was very clear, and I think it's telling when you hear our executive director, Eric Anderson, say, I was under the impression, unfortunately, the wrong one, that we were out ahead, that this region was outpacing our peers in transportation investment. And now I see we are not, and we have been passed by all of our peer regions in terms of composition of investment. What we see in the transit side is that there's more and more pressure than on the local community, right? Whether it's the city of Phoenix, city of Tempe, Glendale, Peoria, passing their own taxes to further enable transportation investments at a localized level. And so, I think what it has provided is some acknowledgement that we do have, there's a reason why it's painful. It's a reason why this RTP process is going to be hard, that a half cent just doesn't go very far, especially for looking at delivering the kinds of systems we see in other places of the country. And I think it's really opened the eyes of policymakers too. I'll give you an example, Eric. At TPC a couple of weeks ago, there was even an exchange about potentially investigating a property tax. Now, I didn't expect going into a TPC meeting that there would have been somebody sitting at TPC saying, hey, maybe we should investigate a property tax. In fact, it kind of took my breath away. I think our managers feel that that's a really hard lift and perhaps isn't a viable one. But what it is doing is really putting and shedding some light on the fact that there is a reason that we're not able to deliver the kinds of transportation investments that others are. It's because we just don't have the funding available, whether it's at the statewide level, where we continue to see a smaller and smaller return on HERF. And that's just focused on roadway investments, as you know, or it's in terms of our composition of transit investments, which compared to everyone else, if it isn't for local funding, which comprises 70% of the transit portfolio that we see in this region, without local funding, we really could not even put together the regional transit network that we have today. And so I think it started to open some eyes, and it certainly justifies the need to at least look beyond a half cent. It's not to say that there's going to be the political will there to carry that forward, but we will be asking voters in some polling we do this winter again to their appetite for expanding a tax base to leverage further investments. I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, it does. That's good information. And I think really where we're at is continuing to share what the reality is. And I know this is what we're doing in Tempe too. I mean, we have a half cent sales tax that's 24 years old now. And while we have done some tremendous things, I think, and made some great achievements in transit in Tempe, we're now realizing that we're not in an expansion mode anymore. We are at O&M, and we're actually in a reduction phase right now because we can't afford what we have today. And that isn't even, we don't have, half our system is at half hour frequency. So I think just highlighting the challenge and the funding, the lack of funding into the future, currently and into the future, I think is going to be important for all of us to do, to try and shift this region towards understanding what kind of investment we really do have to make to get the system that we need for it has to do with the long-term quality of life and vitality, economic viability of the whole region.
Thank you for those comments, Eric. Anyone else have any questions or comments? Hearing none. Audra, thank you for that information. I think moving forward, once we start talking to the public about moving this forward and, you know, finally deciding we put it on a ballot and start kind of disseminating that information, I think this comparison to similar regions is going to be very, very helpful. So thank you for that.
Certainly.
So item number 9, request for future agenda items. Are there any requests by members for an item on a future agenda? Hearing none. Before we adjourn, thank you to staff for pulling this meeting together. I know we hadn't met in several months and things have been a little wonky, but we needed to meet not only to discuss these items, but to see each other. So thank you for your support. I hope I lived up to the very high bar that Chair Crampton has always maintained running this meeting. There a motion to adjourn the meeting?
This is Kristen from Surprise. I motion to adjourn.
Second, Grant.
Thank you. We won't do a roll call. I'll just, all those in favor say aye.
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 Any opposed? All right, we are concluded. Thank you. Stay safe out there, everyone.
Thanks, everyone.